get to the core and the crux of Justice's incredible book, really about a week plus another 2 or 3 days that could have really torn apart South Africa and really led to a civil war. It was actually the intent of the assassins who killed Mandela's protege. But before that, just I always like for people to get an idea of the speaker themselves, the guest we have tonight. Could you briefly just tell us a little bit about your own kind of upbringing, how it was you came to be a young 22-year-old reporter, sadly and probably shockingly, just a matter of hours after his assassination, showing up to the house where sadly the scene is still fresh, where Hani had been assassinated, and even more wickedly assassinated in front of his 14-year-old daughter. Can you talk about your own kind of journey to become a young journalist who, later that year would meet Mandela and meet him other times over the years since then?
Thank you, Ronan. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you to the museum for having me. When I worked in magazines about 10 years ago in Cape Town, Cape Town built a very powerful Holocaust museum, and it was just across the road from me. So it's a very special place for many of us in South Africa, where we have conversations like these, and it's lovely to have been invited here by you and to be in this space. Thank you. I had a chat earlier on with Bob, I think, and Bob was telling me about, and we were just chatting about South Africa, and I think South Africa is one of those places, Ronan, where there was a time when hope was a very rare commodity, where you thought, what is the meaning? As a young person, myself in the 70s and 80s, where I thought, well, what is the meaning of my life? There's no hope, there's no future. It looked impossible that a new and democratic system would come into place. I was born in 1970 into a family in Johannesburg. My father worked on a mine. He started off as a laborer. For those of you involved in education, my father was one of those people who worked in the day underground in the mine, and then at night went to night school, and basically within a period of about 12 years or so, he'd worked himself up to being one of the wages clerks on the mine. And so apartheid was a weird thing, that if you had a bit of education, you could live in the city, which was designated whites only. So I was born at a black hospital in Soweto, and then my first few years in this protected little mining village on Elof Street in Johannesburg. 2 years later, we were kicked out because the apartheid laws really came into play, and areas were designated whites only, and so we ended up being moved by the state to Soweto. That's where I grew. I started schooling. Then I moved. Our family was forced to move because the 1976 riots happened, and it was just across the road from where we lived. And my father felt that, no, I've got to take these guys to the rural areas where my grandmother lived and my aunts and so forth. So I grew up in the far north of South Africa. So as a kid, I go through essentially living under apartheid. My schooling is disrupted, my siblings' school is disrupted, but we keep going and so forth. I finally get to university. 1990 happens. Nelson Mandela walks out of prison. The ANC is unbanned, and you have this wonderful, incredible thing, and that thing is hope. I was 20 years old. I believed this is it. It's possible. It's possible. you think it's going to change. So the period between 1990, after February 1990, was extraordinary in the sense that all of us believed our lives are possible, our hopes are possible. And so, I went and looked for a job. I started working for a newspaper called The Star. It was the main English language newspaper in South Africa at the time, in Johannesburg at the time. I started on the 1st of February, and I believed that, okay, this is it. We are headed towards freedom, towards democracy. We are going to be fully human, if you will. And that is when this assassination takes place. A right-wing extremist comes to South Africa, becomes radicalized, and decides that he's going to shoot and kill Nelson Mandela's protégé, Hani, who was a very popular. In fact, there'd been a survey done just months before, and it showed that this was the most popular politician in South Africa after Mandela himself. So this man, on the 10th of April 1993, approaches Hani as he comes back from buying newspapers at the local cafe. Many of you will remember those days when we used to go out and buy newspapers. Now, anyway, so he follows him home, approaches him, says, "Mr. Hani." Hani turns around, he shoots him twice in the chest, turns around and shoots him twice in the back of his head while his 14-year-old daughter is watching, and he kills him. Hani was such a powerful, charismatic figure in South Africa. Many people, Nelson Mandela said, "I regard this person as my son." Many others just saw him as the next big, possibly Mandela's successor. On that day, I was Easter weekend in South Africa is a bit like Thanksgiving here. It's people head out to be with family and so forth. And the key part was that I was an intern, and so I'd been given with two others. I was told to stay at the newspaper office. And so when we hear about this, my boss comes shouting down to the newsroom where I was and says, "Justice, go to Hani's home." And I say, "What's happening?" He says, Hani has been murdered. And so the news was devastating for so many people across South Africa. For me personally, it was really kind of reversal of the hope that I and many others felt that we could get somewhere. In my mind, I thought South Africa was going to go to war. Nelson Mandela writes in his excellent biography, Long Walk to Freedom, that if there's a day that I thought South Africa was going to go to war after the 1990 developments, this was the day. FW de Klerk, who was president of South Africa at the time, says exactly the same thing. It was a shattering day. And for me, as you say, how did I find myself there? It was almost like you go through a life of almost pure despair, and you have hope thrust upon you for 2 years, and you say, yes, it's happening. It's the end of the apartheid nightmare. And then you're brought to a standstill once again.
And just to maybe give the audience a broader context, you mentioned February 1990, Mandela gets out of prison. De Klerk allows ANC leaders to come back to South Africa or be released from prison. There's a period of hope. You mentioned in the book that the first year or two, Mandela and de Klerk's relationship is fairly good, but it starts getting continually strayed and more strained. In this just 3-year period, over 9,000, 10,000 people are killed, political related violence, most of that, killings by apartheid-related forces. Can you talk about how a lot of the population felt the apartheid government is just stringing us along. They're never announcing an actual transition. They're never announcing elections. And that maybe this dream is kind of starting to fade. And then conversely, from the extremists and kind of white apartheid perspective, the assassin Wallace and his conspirators specifically, they wanted to kill Mandela. They had a list of 10 people, but that was too difficult. Hani was number 3. They felt, if we kill him, we can start a race war. We can start a civil war, and it's better for us to start the civil war while our government is still in power. Can you talk about the real tensions and dire straits the country was in those last few months or year before the assassination?
You know, FW de Klerk made the speech that he's going to unban the ANC and release Nelson Mandela on the 2nd of February 1990. I'm sorry, for South Africans, these dates are embedded in the memory. So the 2nd of February, he makes the announcement. He goes and meets Mandela on the Friday after that, on the 7 days later. And he then says, look, we're going to do the release on Sunday, on the February the 11th. Nelson Mandela says, that's too soon. I gotta prepare. We've gotta prepare the people. We can't just do this. But it's set in stone. You gotta go. We gotta do this. It has to happen. So Nelson Mandela sits down with a young activist on the Saturday who happens to have been just the only senior ANC guy in Cape Town. And he has a very interesting history with the US. In the 1980s, the apartheid government was trying to kill him, and he fled into the US embassy and ended up hiding there for 6 months. But this guy is the only one in Cape Town, and so he's taken to Mandela. They write a speech in which Mandela says, I want to make it a point that I say that FW de Klerk is a man of integrity. And he gets criticized. This young guy, Mohammed Vali Musa is his name, who says, no, you can't do that. It's too early to be complimenting this guy. Mandela says, no, I want to encourage him. I want him to do even better and do more. And, so I'm going to do it. So Mandela comes out on the 11th of February. He says, FW de Klerk is a man of integrity. We should work together. FW de Klerk says at the same time, wow, I've met Nelson Mandela. I've spoken to him. This is a man. Sadly, these men, there were not that many women in both delegations. He says, this is a man I can do business with. So the relationship is cordial. It's tentative, but it's cordial, and it says, let's see if we can. Let's make this work. But then what starts happening is that political violence, which had been confined to the southeast of South Africa, the KwaZulu province where the Mangosuthu, Buthelezi, and other players were, starts spilling out from that province to the main economic hub around Johannesburg. And the way it happened was that a group of men would be armed, would attack communities late in the night, at midnight generally, and subsequent to that we had massacres of people. Our famous one was the Sebokeng massacre. I think 69 people killed. The Buipato massacre. So all this violence starts. Men in balaclavas would come into train coaches and just shoot up ordinary people going to work. And so you suddenly had this violence engulfing the country. Nelson Mandela was very clear that FW de Klerk, you're the president of the country, you should be solving this. FW de Klerk would say, no, this is what he characterized, and the government said, this is black on black violence. And by that it was, no, this is either tribal or this is one black grouping, the ANC, against the IFP, another black grouping. And so Mandela got increasingly frustrated. FW de Klerk was frustrated with Mandela, started saying, I think you are not speaking to your own people, they are complicit in this as well. And so that relationship went from being a man of integrity, a man I can do business with, to by December 1992, it had got to a point where Mandela gave a speech in which he said, I can't believe you are saying this to me. You are not a man of integrity, and so forth and so forth. So the relationship had deteriorated quite significantly by the time 1993 happened. We can talk about this. I'm not sure what your next question was going to be, but it wasn't.
I suppose just about the relationship, and I suppose, and you point out in the book, even the violence, the people who weren't killed by, police or government, security forces. Some of the black-on-black violence is determined later, were gangs or militias hired and supported by the apartheid government, paid and armed to go and attack other black groups across South Africa.
Sure.
Can you talk about, I suppose, really from both their perspectives, but most especially from Mandela's perspective, this next week when the country is on the verge of civil war, it's exactly what the assassin wanted to have happen. It's what a lot of the extremists, in some ways on both sides, wanted to have happen. How was it that Mandela got through his own grief? As you mentioned, this is someone he saw as close as it could be to his own son. He lost his own son when he was in prison. His son was only 11. He was killed in a car crash, and the apartheid government refused to let him attend the funeral. Can you talk about how Mandela, as a statesman, as a leader, had to put aside his own grief and force himself to work with somebody, because at the end of the day, no progress can be made unless he can negotiate with this government?
I mean, I think, this is in part a book of history, but I hope that perhaps we can, for now and for the future, we can learn a few things. What Mandela did in that week was to recognize that you can't tell people that they shouldn't grieve, that they shouldn't show emotion if something as dastardly as this has happened to them, their leaders, people in their community, their children, and so forth. What you see in that week is that there's almost a change of. Mandela gets the news while he's at his rural home in the Eastern Cape, where he grew up, where he went to school, and he'd built himself a house there. He gets the news and he's absolutely devastated. And I leave it as a question in the book, really, about, the first thing he does, he makes some phone calls, speaks to people, but he also goes and visits Chris Hani's family and just says, this is devastating, and I'm here to empathize, be with you at such a time. But over the next few days, what he does is say, we can't say to people, stay at home, do not be angry. Instead of letting that anger manifest in rioting, in people being very angry at this, and the emotions spilling out in ways that we can't handle, we should lead in the grieving. And so he says we must call on people to organize memorial services where they can sit and hear their leaders and themselves talk about Chris Hani and talk about what has happened and basically be communal in this grief. And it's a direct counterpoint to the way FW de Klerk sees this. FW de Klerk says, we can't allow people to go and march when this has happened. They must stay home. They must not get out there. And you know, I've said this before, and it's really, for me, Mandela did something that you know, in South African black culture happens a lot. In that, if someone in my family dies, we create a room in which we sit on the floor, and everyone who comes in to sympathize, to be with us, comes into the room, and we talk about what has happened, how the tragedy happened, and so forth. So in where I come from, you would sit for a week talking about what has happened, grieving, crying with the person who's come in to mourn with you. They make you feel better, you make them feel better. By the end of the week, someone pointed out to me, and I went and read up a bit. You know, people in the Jewish tradition, you'd find Shiva. In other traditions, there are other ways. But it was, in a sense, a communal grief. And Mandela was very clear that we have to share it and lead people in it, instead of sitting and saying, no, don't show any emotion. So what happened in that week was that there were huge rallies and memorial services where people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Mandela himself, others gathered and spoke about this. Mandela went to one where he was booed, for example, because he wasn't being radical enough. People wanted him to be angry, and he said, no, we have a goal, and our goal is this, and so forth. But I think part of what happened that week, and we can talk about some of the other things that are, in my view, leadership elements of what happened in that week, but one of them was saying, you can't try to suppress people's emotions. You can speak to them and say, let us not destroy property, let us not give in to what the perpetrators of this wanted to achieve, yet don't clamp down on that emotion. It's important for people to show their emotion and to vent. On the other side, you know, supporters of Janus Valus, the man who assassinated Chris Hani, and his accomplice, Clive W. Lewis, were very clear. They murder Chris Hani. People are so angry, there is rioting in the streets, and the army then kicks FW de Klerk out, and they install a military army, a military leadership over the country, and they wipe out all the moves that had been made to get rid of apartheid, and we reset to 1975, 1976, where you have Jim Crow, you have all the elements of apartheid that had been in place. And so this, you know, as the week goes by, this gets nearer and nearer, and there is more and more talk that, well, de Klerk has lost control of the country, so should there be something like this or not, and so forth. And that was the danger. That would have been the win, if you will, by the assassins and whoever was supporting them.
And, you know, as you note beautifully in the book, like I said, it reads like a political thriller with incredible characters, except they're all real, and you know, and of course the legendary Mandela himself. This is really the week when Mandela was ascendant, but at this point, you note in the book, even de Klerk realizes, I cannot go on television and tell people to calm down, to where he needs Mandela to go on, talk to the nation. And this is really, the elections, nothing has been set, nothing has been scheduled at this point, but this is kind of the defining moment when Mandela truly becomes the de facto leader of all of South Africa. And can you maybe talk about his graciousness in when he himself is grieving for someone he loved dearly? He is concerned and worried about mass violence taking off, being pushed for both sides. But he makes overtures to the white South African population. He says, I want a country for all of us. I want a country for white South Africans. He specifically notes and recognizes it was a white woman in Chris Hani's neighborhood who was the key witness, who bravely came forward to give evidence to the police. Can you talk about, even in those difficult, dark days, his efforts towards reconciliation between all the groups within South Africa?
I mean, I think the key thing about that week was Mandela's leadership, and in this one instance that you refer to, so the killer goes and shoots Chris Hani in front of his daughter, and steps back, gets into his car, and drives off. The context is that Chris Hani had come back from exile in 1991. In 92, had bought himself, his wife and 3 kids, a house in a very conservative part of South Africa, a suburb of a town called Boksburg. And Boksburg was the last, even in 1989, when most of South Africa was desegregating. Boksburg had posters on the street saying, we will not, and we, keep black people out and so forth. It wasn't a good place. He moves into this neighborhood. Many of the neighbors are, oh, what's going to happen now? This man has moved in here and so forth. And so he jogs in the morning in the neighborhood, says hello to people and so forth. And some of them are, oh, well, this is interesting. But it's a very conservative area. This woman on that Saturday gets up and says, I've got to go do some shopping. She drives out of her yard to go to the local shoe shop, and she realizes that, I'm trying to be very far thinking for that time. I'm trying to, not use plastic bags. And she stops her car, reverses, and goes to get her bags. As she drives back out, she sees this man murder Chris Hani. She drives back home. She calls the police, and I've run a bit of the transcript of that conversation to the police, in which she says, I memorized the registration plate, and it is this, and this is what the man looked like. And within 30 minutes of that phone call, the police managed to stop a man in this red car and arrest him, and basically that's how Johannesburg is. But no one makes a thing about it. Nelson Mandela, on the 3rd day of this crisis, after he's given a speech on the day on television, he then says, I need to make another speech to the nation because, people are dying now. The emotions are high. There is a lot of, the leader of one of the right-wing groups went on, gave a speech in which he said, I would have killed Chris Hani myself. It was becoming more and more tense. Mandela goes and says, I want to go back on television. His speech writers do a speech for him, and he changes the first 3 paragraphs of the statement and replaces those 3 paragraphs. I'm paraphrasing now, but he says, I'm reaching out to every South African, black and white, from the bottom of my heart, to reach for peace and blah, blah, blah. And then he says, a white man full of hate came to our country and assassinated one of our beloved sons. A white woman saw the killer and called the police, and that led to the arrest of this man. And by doing that, he did something very clever. In just 2 sentences, the killers of Chris Hani wanted black and white. They wanted to delineate South Africa as in blacks are against whites and whites against blacks, and we are set for a war without end, and it must continue like this. Those two sentences got quoted again and again, and it's not the race, it's about people who are trying to derail what we are trying to build, a new South Africa, a South Africa shorn of the racial divisions of the past. And that for me was a masterstroke, a beautiful turn in the way things had been going. And it's just one example of those things.
I just want to ask two more questions, and I'll open it up to the audience. We have question cards, if any of you want to use those. My colleagues are passing them around. This, obviously is a very difficult time in South Africa's history. We're in an esteemed institution that, focuses upon repression, kind of history of genocide, whether it be, the Holocaust, and they also highlight incredible abuses that have happened in other parts of the world over time and over history. What do you think the role was of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that came a few years later? And I suppose the difficult decision for any human rights body or any group of people or country trying to move forward in balancing the need for justice against vile and wicked people like Wallace, who assassinated Chris Hani, shooting him cold blood right in front of his child, with the need for saying we need to have some form of reconciliation and move forward, even if it means letting hundreds and maybe thousands of people off the hook for violent crimes they committed.
I speak for myself, and I hope for many South Africans. In South Africa, what happened after 1994, we set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as you say, and as a body itself, many of us felt that it didn't go far enough in the investigation of many of the crimes that were committed under apartheid. The assassination of Chris Hani is one of those that, the allegations of a greater conspiracy were not followed up. The investigators felt that they were not given the support to go to. There were allegations that there were links to right-wing groups in Europe and so forth and so forth. And so the family of Chris Hani to this day still believes that there was a wider conspiracy to the murder of Chris Hani. That said, putting human rights at the center of building a new country, of your framework, is an incredible, incredible thing. In December, Janus Wallus, the person who pulled the trigger and murdered Chris Hani, was released on parole in South Africa. Janus Wallus has been eligible for parole in South Africa for 11 years, had been eligible for parole for 11 years. His accomplice, Clive W. Lewis, was released in 2016 on compassionate grounds because he was dying from cancer. But a human rights framework means for me that someone like Wallace and Clive W. Lewis, under apartheid in 1993, the two men were arrested, went on trial, and were sentenced to death in South Africa. 6 months later, Nelson Mandela became president in 1994. The first thing he did was to say, we're building a constitution that is based on human rights, and we don't believe the state should kill. And so on the 10th of May 1994, all death sentences were commuted to life. And so Janus Wallis was not killed by the state. Janus Wallis applied to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He wasn't given amnesty because the commission didn't believe that he disclosed. He was evasive in his testimony and so forth. I think it's important, it's absolutely crucial for societies to look at what has been done in our names. And we need to face that and look it in the eye. I feel that I am a better human being for the fact that my country, the state that I regard as my state, the state of South Africa, did not choose vengeance, did not choose to say people like Janus Wallis and Clive W. Lewis should be hanged, as many people were under apartheid and so forth. I think the truth is the key thing, seeing the truth, finding it, and facing it. Reconciliation is a journey that many countries, many people, it's a hard journey, it's tough, and you have to leave it to people. The widow of Chris Hani is not happy that Janus Wallis has been released. She feels that he has not told all the truth. I say to people in South Africa who say, why is she so angry? We wrote this constitution that allows us to free this man. I say, I can't tell people how to grieve, and I can't dictate to them how to grieve. I don't know what it's like to lose a husband at age 50 and to live another 30 years without that person. But I don't think the state, I think the state has been, by putting at the heart and center of that constitution, human rights, I think it's made for a better society in many ways. Perhaps not fully so. We have lots of problems in South Africa, and we can talk about that. But I think the work of truth is first. The work of reconciliation comes alongside truth, but we can't dictate at the human one-to-one level. But I think we can try.
And lastly, that decision to not call for vengeance, to not pursue justice, whether within the law, without the law, that leadership came from Mandela himself, despite the abuses he'd been through, almost 30 years of very difficult time in prison. We mentioned, obviously losing someone, his protege that he loved like a son. You met Mandela for the first time a few months after this assassination, and other times, obviously, as a journalist beyond then. What are the kind of most impressive things that you took away from meeting this kind of legendary, iconic, global figure? And then people might ask about it anyway. Obviously, every president who came after George Washington, the next few is going to be very hard to follow up to George Washington. Nobody is going to fill the shoes of Mandela, but maybe could you talk about your perspectives on the ANC in South Africa since Mandela, and those two, and then we'll go turn to the audience.
No, thank you. Just quickly, I think it's important that one of the failures to the question you're throwing forward to, I do think that there has been a failure. The failure is justice. Justice is a very different. I think the Mandela government failed, for example, to investigate and show up the truth. I'm for standing up for justice. I think people need to see justice served. I think societies do better if justice is served and is seen to be served. I think part of the of the failure of the post-1994 South Africa is that we had truth, and we even spoke and had a lot of reconciliation, if you will. But justice, if I were to say to you, tell me about the torture and so forth of so many of the ANC's activists, many people, we can sit here all evening and talk about the names, people who were bombed by the apartheid government. You start with Ruth First, you start with the killing of Steve Biko, you start with, I think Albie Sachs, one of our most famous judges, has been here, I think at the university here. This is a man who walks around his arm blown off because they sent him a letter bomb and so forth. But they are amazing, incredible human beings who say, I have forgotten. But part of my little niggle with that is that justice has not been served because Albie Sachs, for example, the family of Steve Biko, they don't know who did this. So the justice part is a very difficult, and I don't think we've achieved it in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was amazing. I told you this story in another context. We were just chatting earlier today, but it's worth telling. Nelson Mandela, I was 20, in fact, 2 months after the events described in this book, I met Nelson Mandela for the first time. I said, my name is Justice. Oh, he said, oh, Justice, that's a lovely name. My cousin's name was Justice. Now, I was sitting there, I was shaking that I'm meeting Nelson Mandela. I couldn't speak. I was just dumbstruck. And this man is doing his utmost best to make me feel settled and just feel good. And so he tells me the story of his cousin, how his cousin and they grew up together, and their uncle tried to marry them off, and that's how they ended up in Joburg. They ran off away from their uncle. But he was an incredibly warm, empathetic man who I think gave so much, suffered so much, and yet still had the outstanding humanity to still see. He never got cynical about people, about the world. The last time I'd seen him, I saw him, this was in 2010, 3 years before his passing. I remember I'd started a newspaper which went under in a very public way. And he remembered, he said, oh, Justice, how are you? Sorry about your newspaper, I used to read it. And I said, he doesn't have to remember that. He was an amazing, incredible, warm, visionary person. And I think his vision of the world was one that many of us would do well to emulate.
I think a sign of just rare, true leadership, compassionate, but also willing to listen to people at all levels, and sometimes take more time listening than talking. Just to follow up on that, just to bring it to the modern day, Daria from a student from the Audi International School asks a good question. In modern South African politics, who, as in a person or party organization, do you think comes closest to representing Mandela's ideals?
South Africa is going through a hard time at the moment. There are challenges everywhere. There are challenges in governance. Corruption has become endemic. There is a sense of drift in South Africa at the moment, and many of us are very concerned, and many of us are saying we need to see a change, a turnaround. 5 years ago, President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is, one of the central characters in this book, was one of Nelson Mandela's assistants. He was the chief negotiator of the ANC at the democracy talks. 5 years ago, he became president of South Africa. A man we both admire, Bill Keller, who used to be the editor of the New York Times, wrote a big piece in the New York Times magazine saying, I think the values, the vision of Nelson Mandela is back, because one of his proteges, Cyril Ramaphosa, is coming back, and he's coming back to clean up, and South Africa will make the turnaround. So it's 5 years down the line, and South Africa is for many people, it's taking a step back instead of having made that leap following in Mandela's footsteps. So the question is great. I'd like to say it's a question that I've been grappling with myself, and I think one of the successes of the Mandela leadership was that Mandela very quickly made sure that there was a framework for leadership, and that was in our constitution and so forth. So I actually might have one or two people that I think are great, but I think the system is failing us because it says justice is a great leader, and we all want to coalesce around it. And what I think we need is, one, for the system to be able to outlive a great leader and outlive a bad leader. And we need the society to produce a cohort, generationally, of people who, not alone, but as a group, to have a sense of coherence that we can all be a part of and build a society that way. Cyril Ramaphosa is someone that I'm one, I was on Bill Keller's kind of side on this one. It was, no, he'll be the one. President Ramaphosa at the moment is mired in scandal, some of it very sordid, to be honest. The economy is tanking very badly. Unemployment, youth unemployment, that is unemployment for people between the age of 18 and 32, is at 64%. So what this does is that it makes for a very fragile place, and I'd like to see us move away from that. I think there are some leaders, but I think part of the success of the ANC's campaign, whether it was in the US, in Europe, all over the world, in the 1980s, was to present not just Nelson Mandela as the face of freedom, that we have the depth of leadership across the board, whether it's on the economy, in diplomacy and so forth, for the ANC to take over and run a democratic country. And I think the first 15 years, the Mandela 5 years, the Thabo Mbeki had his many shortcomings, but I think, in a sense, the economy, the consolidation of the country as one country, I think we were on the right track. I think it's over the past 13 or so years that we've...
Okay, and I'll just do two more audience quick questions. I know it might be hard to be a bit brief, but just for the sake of time, we started a few minutes late, I know, because of the traffic and the weather. A very interesting question here from Bob. He asks, the Frenchman Alex de Tocqueville wrote eloquently about democracy in America. Often those who live outside the U.S. can see our shadow. What is your perspective of race relations in the U.S.? Easy question. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I'm actually I'm somewhat saddened by. I'm sad. I have two kids. 19 and 16. 4.5 years ago, I'd lived in the US about 20 years ago. I was a correspondent for a newspaper here, and I'm going to be brief. And you know, my wife and I and my kids, we like to move around, so we've lived in several places. 4 years ago, we said, oh, we're going to live in California. The weather's great. It looks like Cape Town. It's going to be great. So we moved here, and something heartbreaking happened to me in the sense that my kids we'd go and visit friends, and we knew quite a few people, and they'd say, no, Papa, you mustn't drive. And I couldn't understand what was going on. And when they got here, they'd read a brilliant book called The Hate You Give by, I can't remember her name. And I think it's been made into a movie. And my innocent children who'd grown up in South Africa, which is still dealing with racial division and oppression and all sorts of things, and they've learned about these things in school. I always say to people, the United States doesn't realize just how influential it's been. My earliest memories, and part of what I write about in this book, is Muhammad Ali, and what a massive force he was in South Africa, that this man stood up and said the things he said, whether about all kinds of things. And in that week that I write about, Muhammad Ali happened to land in South Africa at the same time as Chris Hani was being murdered. And he involved himself in the marches and the struggles and spoke and attended the funeral and so forth. So many of us were inspired hugely by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others in this country. And to have, when I saw my kids essentially actively saying, you must not drive because you're a black man in America, and they were scared, it broke my heart. And it's colored my view of the United States this time around. And I think a lot about how is it that leaders can speak about law and order, for example, and I refer specifically to the events around the events around and after the killing of George Floyd, in which very different to Mandela's reaction to the murder of Chris Hani, that people were talking about law and order, not the rule of law. And the rule of law is a very different concept in that it says there must be justice for what has happened to this man. And so people must be charged. And people don't stop and say, if we're talking about the rule of law, then the rule of law means charges must be laid, a court must oversee, there must be a trial, and a jury of your peers must decide, and you either go to jail or you're freed and so forth. A lot of times when the rule of law has to apply in these cases, I don't do it much anymore, but I used to run a lot. I love running, and one of the things I used to do when I was younger, I remember I came to the US once, and I remember the first thing I did, I always had my running shoes and my shorts, and I'd arrive and I'd get to my hotel, and then I'd run through the city just to look at it, and that's what I did. And when Ahmed Aubrey went running, and he got killed for running, and it just, I cannot believe such injustice. And I'm not meaning his killing, I mean the fact that the police did not do anything, and that this is institutional. I don't see how there isn't an uproar about it. So my views about race relations here, I think it's time to essentially stop making this a thing about, oh, the other side of the house says this and the other side of the house says this. I think the truth is that every human being should be appalled at some of these things. And it shouldn't be, I am of this party and of that party. Every human being should see this for what it is. And it troubles me and it devastates me that what needs political leadership is not receiving the political leadership it
Yeah, and I would say if any of you are interested, on June 14th, Jahan mentioned the program, we're hosting Civil War by Other Means, America's Unfinished Fight for Democracy. And Jeremy Surrey, an excellent historian, that's what he's talking about. We had kind of a brief window after the Civil War, before Reconstruction was collapsed and ended, and kind of our own, we call it Jim Crow, which is a euphemism, but basically it's another form of apartheid. We had basically until the Civil Rights era, and we still have a lot of work to do since then. But I am volunteering Justice to hang around and sign the books afterwards. I encourage all of you to get it if you want to learn a lot. I'm really privileged to host a lot of fascinating people. This is one of the books I've learned the most from. I really enjoyed a lot. So we'll be signing those afterwards. Just to kind of combine two audience questions and maybe just kind of a bit of reflection for you. John asks, and just kind of in terms of the overall leadership of the anti-apartheid movement, John asks, was it possible that anti-apartheid leaders like Mandela, Tutu, Sachs, how was it that they were able to not call for vengeance, that they were able to keep the violence? You talked about it some already, kind of restrained, especially after the assassination of Hani. And then William asks kind of a related question. If these killers had had their way, the top of the list, number one of the list of 10 people they were going to assassinate was Mandela. If Mandela had been assassinated, where would South Africa be today? Another easy, short answer.
Thank you. We had a chat with this gentleman in front here. I'm so sorry, I'll get your name after this. But one of the chats we had earlier was about a lady called Helen Suzman. Helen Suzman was the one in a parliament of about, at the time, 200 members. She was the one opposition leader in that house. And every day she'd put a question to the apartheid government, Mr. President, is it true that this prisoner was tortured on this day and so forth? And she got the information and asked the question, and they hated her, but they didn't know how to kill her or find a way to get rid of her. In 1993, the US had an ambassador in South Africa. He'd been an ambassador in other parts of the continent, but ended up in South Africa. I don't think he was ambassador at the time. His name was Princeton Lyman. And he tells a story in an article he wrote in Forbes magazine, or Fortune, one of them, in which he says, at some point he asked the ANC leaders, how did you get to that point where you settle with the other side? And someone said to him, we were just exhausted, and we just knew that if we didn't settle, if we didn't reach an agreement, there would be nothing. The country would go up in flames. So I think a recognition that this is not playing around. You can't just say, oh, we'll just divvy up the country and these guys can go there and so forth. You're talking about bloodshed when you say these things. And I think there was a recognition on both sides that this is serious and we need to save this country by finding a solution that works for everyone. And there were no straight winners. You know, people might think, oh, Mandela won. Democracy won, largely. Mandela made a lot of concessions. The apartheid government made many other concessions and so forth, but they reached that stage. If Mandela had been the one killed, we'd have had to find some other leadership. And I like to think at that point, at that moment, I think that leadership would have come through. I think a lot about Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's been mentioned in the question. I'd like to write one day. I'm too exhausted to write another book now, but maybe one day I'd like to revisit. I'd like to revisit a moment in his life in which, you know, a lot of things happened in the struggle against apartheid. One of the most shameful of those is when anti-apartheid activists would identify Ronan Justice at a huge gathering and say Justice is a spy. And the most horrific thing would happen. People would, a car tire would be put up around their neck and they would be burnt to death. There was a day when Archbishop Desmond Tutu and another priest, Archbishop Simeon Nkwane, there were 50,000 people. A man was identified as an apartheid police spy. And these young people said he must be burnt to death, this is the enemy, and so forth. They went and defended him with their lives. They got him out of that crowd of thousands of people and got him and saved his life. And I always say, that is a moment. How many of us would have looked away because there were so many people? And it's an act of such bravery and humanity and doing the right thing in the face of huge, huge, huge danger. But people do that. And they weren't the only ones. Other people did the same thing, and that practice thankfully stopped. But it's those moments of leadership, of courage, that I hope would have come through even if Mandela had been the one killed. And the moment would have required the Chris Hanis of the world to stand up and be counted.
Again, we have just his incredible book, The Plot Saved South Africa, The Week Mandela Averted Civil War and Forged a New Nation. He's going to hang around and sign them afterwards. I want to thank again, Kelly and Kenneth and Chris and everyone at the Holocaust Museum Houston. It's always wonderful to work with you all. And will you all please join me in thanking Justice Malala? Thank you.